think there's opportunities, all that to say, where we can play a role, right? Like higher ed can't do all of the socialization around politics, but I think we have a really unique and important role in the opportunities that we have to have those conversations, to think about, wow, what happened on Tuesday at the Iowa, or Monday at the Iowa caucuses? What did you see? What did you hear? What was interesting? How does that relate to where you grew up? How was it different? And those probing questions get students to think, right? And help them think about their own values, their own lived experiences.
Welcome to Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Heather Shea. Today on the podcast, I'm welcoming back two folks who have participated in previous episodes to talk a bit about their joint work on a project that came from the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education called Democracy Redesigned, which I learned about in November at ASHE last year. And as I was thinking about this, we're nearing the 2024 election. In fact, we're recording this episode just a couple of days after the Iowa caucuses. And there seems to be a fair amount of conversation about the risks to democracy in the US. And as a student affairs educator, as we collectively seek to engage students in discussing, dissecting, reinventing, identifying their own democratic values that we need to have in 2024 and beyond, I was really excited to welcome Demetri and Adam to the show today. So their offices, as well as the IDHE, or the Institute for Democracy in Higher Ed, are resources to look to. And this new model that we'll be talking about today, about to be unveiled, is an incredible tool. So thank you both for being here today. It's great to have you. Before I welcome both of them on, I'm going to just say a little bit about the podcast and about our sponsors for today. So Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We hope you find these conversations make a contribution to the field and are restorative to the profession. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays, and you can find us at studentaffairsnow.com, on YouTube, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. This episode would not be possible without the support of one of our new sponsors, Rutledge Taylor Francis. You can view their complete catalog of authoritative education titles at www.rutledge.com/education. And this episode is also sponsored by LeaderShape. Go to leadershape.org to learn how they can work with you to create a just, caring, and thriving world. As I mentioned, I am the host for today's episode, Heather Shea. My pronouns are she, her, and her. And I am broadcasting from the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples, otherwise known as East Lansing, Michigan, home of Michigan State University, where I work. So let's get on to the conversation. Welcome back to both of you. So excited to have this conversation today. Maybe we could begin with each of you providing a brief introduction, talk a little bit about your role, your work as part of IDHE and NSolve. I know that's an acronym that one of you will tell us about. And then generally how you got involved in this project, and maybe a little bit more about your work on your respective campuses as well. And how you're entering today's conversation. I'm hopeful, but I am curious what you both think. So Adam, we'll start with you. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me and Demetri today. It's exciting to be back and talking about one of my favorite topics. I would say I'm entering the conversation today determined. So I wouldn't say either optimistic or pessimistic or anything, but determined to identify and help solve problems, I guess. So I direct NSolve, which is a national study of learning, voting, and engagement. It's the largest study of student voting in the country at Tufts University. And prior to that, I was director of impact at the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education. Until recently, IDHE was sort of the umbrella organization that housed NSolve, and was also located at IDHE It and our founder, Nancy Thomas, is now at AAC&U. And yeah, I'm sure we'll talk more about that today. She was one of the partners in this work. And yeah, it's been exciting to work with Demetri on this project, who I'll turn it over to now.
Great. Welcome, Demetri.
Thanks so much. Really excited to be here with you, Heather and Adam. So I'm Demetri. You see him pronouns. I'm a faculty member at Loyola University Chicago. I have been connected to Tufts and IDHE and Adam and Nancy for a few years now, but the way I got into this work, like most kind of really involved undergraduate student leaders, a lot of my sort of political sense making and understandings happened as I was involved in fraternity sorority life or participating in student clubs and activities. And so as I moved through graduate school and continued to have opportunities to work with students, I kind of saw that this idea of how people were engaging in politics was becoming an increasing feature of how people not only identified, but also how it impacted and enveloped so many other components of campus life. And so did my dissertation work on the student identity or political identity development of students and kind of bridged some of our kind of OG student development theories and tried to merge them with sort of organizational thinking. So what happens? And so I was thinking in very similar ways to the ways that Adam and Nancy Thomas and others were thinking about just kind of how complex this kind of political landscape is. And so we've been partners over the last few years working on trying to continue to kind of think through and provide resources and tools for different members of the community. And so really excited to talk about some of those today.
Well, it's really exciting. It was such an awesome session at ASH, and I learned a lot, and it's exciting to be able to talk about this right in this kind of moment in time too. So this is a really timely conversation. But Demetri, let's stay with you for a moment, because I want to just for basic definition purposes, let's begin with what is democracy? How do you define democracy? What are the fundamental principles and practices of democratic participation and policymaking? And we'll kind of go from there. So let's give some basics for our audience.
Yeah, I love this question as a former political science major and, as somebody who kind of, lives and drinks and sleeps the sort of political theater of it all. And on the one hand, it's a super hard question because it's all of those things you just mentioned. And depending on who you're talking to and what context you're talking about, it means different things to different people. So one of the things that I've appreciated about how Tufts and IDHE has even helped me to kind of simplify but still be rigorous in how we understand democracy is we talk about kind of two concepts. And so one of those is this idea that democracy is a form of governance, meaning that it's made up of systems and structures and policies. So think about things like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the way that our justice system is set up, the separation of powers, the states and the federal government. These are all systems and structures that give us some structure to how we operate in a form of governance. And so that's important because societies need governance. Democracy is a version of that. And if you want to be really technical, it's we're a democratic republic because we elect our officials, so it's not a direct democracy. But that structure piece is important. The way that I kind of talk about it with students as well is, think about a skeleton or think about the human body. You need the skeleton to give you some structure. And so the governance part of democracy is kind of like our bones, right? It gives us a structure. And just like bones can decay and need to be maintained and healthy, we need to, have structures and systems and policies and laws that are continuously updated. So we'll get into that. And then the other part we talk about is that democracy is also a culture, meaning that it shapes the way that people interact with each other and interact with society, interact with those systems and governance structures. So it creates norms. There are symbols. Think of the American flag. Think of the eagle as kind of the national component. Think about the different state flags that are often, so there are symbols as part of the culture, and then there's also just the norms. When we talk about voting, when we talk about participating, there are expectations, both explicit and implicit, about what it means to do democracy. And those are kind of cultural pieces. And so that's important because, again, just like a body has, skin and kind of gives it its flavor and personality, how we do democracy adds, different dimensions and different ways of experiencing the structures and system. And so even though we technically all have similar systems and structures, how we experience those things are going to be lived and experienced very differently depending on our identities and where we're from and our background and all of those things. So we try to break it down, all that being said, into this governance and into culture to kind of, as best as possible, help us understand how dynamic democracy is and how we got to be really specific about what we're talking about, because we could be talking about democracy in general, but really I'm talking about the culture piece of it and you're talking about the structure and policy piece of it, and we might be missing each other. And so those two buckets give us a little bit of nuance without being super technical and jargony that sometimes the political scientists of us all like to get into.
That's great. That's really a helpful way of thinking about it. I like the bones metaphor because, for me, it's like you have to have a framework. You have to have kind of that like existing structure, and then what's on top of that is also important. So I guess the follow-up that I have for this, and I said it in the beginning, is that there's been a lot of conversation about our democracy being threatened. Either of you, do you think democracy is at risk in 2024? A risk of, the bones breaking or, completely deteriorating, like an osteoporosis? Well, we could stop with this metaphor.
Yeah, I'll tackle it first. So in some ways, no, I don't think. I'm not convinced or compelled by the arguments that it's at risk, because there are some segments of the population, particularly people with minoritized identities, women, people of color, trans and non-binary people who, we often say democracy was never built for and designed for. And so in one respect, democracy never worked for, significant segments of our population. And so it's almost like the kind of make America great again language. It's like, well, when was America great and for whom? And so the same thing is like, is democracy being threatened? Well, for some people, the promises of democracy have never been realized or never been enacted upon. And so the question sort of presupposes, not your question, but the sort of general sense presupposes a particular experience that leaves out certain people. And so I always like to nuance it. On the other hand, I think, every generation goes through particular events, whether it's the Vietnam War or, what we describe as like focusing events, right? Things that bring people together. I'm sort of an elder millennial, and so came of age in the sort of 9/11, sort of war on terror. So every generation has things that sort of bring us to the brink that says like, is this the best we can do in this, system of governance? And is this really working for us? Like, I'll never forget being in college, going through the Great Recession, and it being like, am I going to have a job? Like, is this, how the world ends? Right. So I think every generation has, and then you kind of go through it and it's like, okay, like that was bad, but we made it through it. And so I think there is a little bit of resiliency in people. I would not argue so much as the sort of systems. There's resiliency in people to be to find ways to persist and to be resistant to things that are not working and remake them anew. That gives me a little bit of hope. But I do think we are at a sort of generational moment where things are pretty bad. But are they any worse than Vietnam? I don't know. I wasn't around in Vietnam, but in some of the ones that have been particularly nerve-wracking for me, this is definitely on par, but I'm like, I thought the world was literally going to end in 2007. I just didn't know what was going to happen. Everybody was losing their home. And now, here we are. So that perspective, I think, as, people age, also sort of balances out the moment a little bit. But I definitely think for our college students right now, this is a pretty harrowing time.
Yeah. What about you, Adam? What do you think? Are we at risk?
I think since we're all going to our college majors, I was a sociology major, and one of the things that I think about is like the notions of folkways and mores, and like some of the informal ways in which, Demetri talked about the governance structures of democracy and then the cultural aspects of democracy. And I think some of the things that we took for granted as like, oh, you can't really do that in this country, or this wouldn't work for a politician or something like that, that weren't codified or were loosely codified, are the things that are definitely at risk. Because I think that we're starting to see like some formulas emerge of how to get around some of those systems or how to disregard some of them. That concerns me. And I think I think maybe the way I would say it is like democracy as we know it is at risk, but the democracy as we know it, as Demetri said, is like, does it work for everyone? Like what are the pluses of it? What are the negatives? And so that's part of what this framework is designed for, is to think about an aspirational vision of democracy. So with IDHE, so I was a part of the IDHE team since kind of like the early days through like I said, it just moved for almost 8 years. And one of the things that we always got questions about was just the fact that the word democracy was in our title, Institute for Democracy and Higher Education. And so I started making it a habit for myself that at every presentation I would address that actually proactively, to think about like, why is that in there, and to talk about it with our audiences. And it was always centered on this idea, and I think this is part of the founding principles of the office, that when we talk about democracy, we're talking about the democracy that we want to all be part of creating and sort of co-creating. And in that context, it was with kind of youth, with college students, with people in the higher ed realm. So yeah, I mean, I think that like the sort of conventional wisdom thoughts around democracy and what we can assume about it, I think a lot of that is at risk. But I think for some people, actually across the political spectrum, it's sort of a question of, okay, so what? Like, I didn't like democracy anyway, or like I think there are a lot of people that have that viewpoint, some very rightfully, because it's, as Demetri said, it hasn't always worked for everybody, and in some cases actively worked against people. So I think part of the work to be done in the democracy space is to think creatively and think broadly, think widely with a wide aperture around what democracy can look like and how it can serve the public good, and then how we can think about our social problems and then build a system that addresses those.
Yeah. I mean, this conversation is making me think on so many different levels, right? Like, it is about the one-to-one person engagement with a democratic process, like going in and voting. It's also about the systems and structures that allow for people to vote. And then it's also about like the broader belief that we should promote and continue to have a democratic society, at least in the US. So there's so many like layers, it seems like, as we're kind of unpacking this a little bit. I am really interested in hearing more about the model, but let's talk a little bit about the historical component here, because I know Democracy Redesigned is actually the second, or maybe the multiple third phase
Mhm.
of a broader project. So Adam, can you tell us a little bit about some of the reasons why that project was initiated, Democracy by Design? What were some of the opportunities that presented themselves, given our recent history? And how have we been able to, in kind of problematizing some of the things that have happened in our society, like strengthen this initiative?
Sure. So actually, a lot of the work, I want to be clear, predates Demetri and I's involvement in the project. Nancy, who we mentioned, Nancy Thomas at AAC&U, was part of several meetings in the late 2000s into the early 2010s at various convenings and conferences. And there were conversations around some of these big picture issues of democracy, and a number of civic organizations were involved. And so about 10 years ago, the first version of Democracy by Design was published in the Journal of Public Deliberation. And I think what Nancy was going for with that was bringing together a lot of these ideas that were just starting to emerge within, I think, like the spaces within which she was engaging at that time. And the initial model, the thought was, okay, if we have these different like sort of buckets of what makes up an aspirational democracy, in the higher ed context, there can be this idea of, okay, this is a model for us to think about when we talk about civic and democratic outcomes of university life. And so I think the original thought around this was that students would learn a little bit from every category of democracy, but then do a project where they learn a lot about one of the areas. And so you have this kind of cross-cutting vision for political learning on college campuses. So that model was released in 2014, I believe. And then in 2018 at IDHE, we had a lot of really difficult conversations around what was the role of our office, what was the role of civic organizations and organizations centered around democracy. And the project kind of reemerged of like, oh, maybe that model should be revisited. And so there was, I think it was called Democracy by Design Revisited. And that came out in 2018 in the Journal of Public Deliberation again. And there was a question around, should deliberative democracy be a central part of this work, and would it adequately address some of these issues? So I think that it was seen as like an improved version of it, but in 2020, 2021, we had conversations of like, okay, we really need to like go into this and, do some version of like really rethinking it, turning it upside down, and grow the team that's working on it. So several of us at IDHE were part of it. I do also want to credit Norma Lopez, another faculty member, Loyola Chicago, who was part of this with Demetri. Had been working on the IDHE team at the time as well. And several graduate students and folks from our team like all chipped into it. But for that phase of the project, we looked very widely around different reports that had come out, research that had been done. We did interviews and focus groups with folks from different organizations to think about, like, to kind of, I think, challenge our own thinking on this, but then also see like, what are we missing? What really are the threats to democracy? And then what would it, like a fully functioning aspirational vision of democracy be? And so over the course of many meetings and collaborative efforts, writing, speaking through the issues, the model that we're going to talk through was sort of what emerged from that. And I should say that the project was largely funded through the generosity of the Lumina Foundation. And so it gave us kind of the encouragement and the resources and the time and space to work through mass amounts of information and to think really critically about what had come before and then what might come next from it.
Yeah. I think we've
Only
kind of,
thing
yeah, go ahead.
I just really briefly, I think it's important about the history, and we see this not only in the like civic learning and democratic engagement space, but in many sectors of higher education where kind of an interested group of professionals or faculty or an association will put out a report and say, hey, here's this problem, basic needs. Here's this problem, low voting rates. Here's this problem. And so they'll do a really rigorous report and they'll sort of name and frame the problem. And then there'll be sort of subsequent, research and resources allocated towards the endeavor. And it, eventually sometimes becomes sort of normalized, right? Like I think basic needs within, sort of the last 10 to 15 years is like a good example of it being on some people's radar the whole time. But in terms of, many, people sort of saying like, oh yeah, students' basic needs on campus, we can't take it for granted. What are we doing? Pantries and blah, 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 blah. So I think there's a culture in higher ed that's not unique to the civic learning and democratic engagement space of sort of doing reports and trying to spotlight issues and provide recommendations and rationale. And I think what we were also very thoughtful of, and as Adam mentioned, we spent a lot of time with, literally since the 60s, there's been successive reports about higher ed's role in democracy. So starting then all the way through to, the Crucible moment that came out in 2012, Nancy's work that Adam mentioned, there's been these, really important reports that have come out that we also wanted to sit with and analyze and say, how do we kind of get out of that kind of boom to bust like report, lots of focus, and then to something that's a little bit more enduring? We hope, we'll see, but it's something that's a little bit more enduring, that has some flexibility in the framework, that isn't just talking about a particular moment, and why the aspirational piece is really important. And I think, again, for the historical context, that's important to know, because I think, you can think about, some of the student affairs, sort of foundational documents, like we just have this culture. And so we're also trying to break out of that a little bit to present a framework that we hope is a little bit more enduring and also malleable to the different things that happen as, campuses are continuing to respond to how democracy is continuing to change and adapt.
I really appreciate that, because I was thinking about models that are just like codified and then on a shelf, right? And we constantly kind of push back of like, who does this apply to? Who was study that created this model? And so I love that this group has really kind of revisited, re-envisioned, redesigned multiple times, because that's the nature of the work that we do broadly, but also when I think about all the new challenges that have arisen in the last 10 years, right? Like the model from 2014 or whatever year, what would not be relevant today, as relevant maybe. But I love that there's that constant kind of re-envisioning.
Can I add just one thing on that point, Heather? So that was what you're describing is, I think, what animated the whole idea of us doing this as a session at ASHE last year. Ana Martinez Alemán, who is the president of ASHE, invited us to come talk through the model, and credit to Demetri on being like, what I think this audience would like really benefit from, and what I think people would be excited by, and what I think would help the model is this like a kind of a teach-in format, which is very different from past ASHE conferences, at least the ones that I've been to. And so we sort of introduced the model, and then we leaned on some amazing scholars. I mean, Demetri and I had this very long list of like a dream list of who might be able to help lead discussions in a large, conference space. And much to our delight, like pretty much everyone that we asked who was able to be there said yes and was enthusiastic about it. And so I think for us, it's really a matter of like, it's a snapshot. It's like an existing thing. It'll be a document, I'm sure. And you'll see the image of it that's static. But I think for us, it really is like a snapshot. And it's like the minute you kind of like put it out there, it's ready to be kind of ripped up and like revisited, and that we want to layer as many perspectives as we can on this, because I think that's the beauty of work in the democracy space, is that it's hard to come in and be prescriptive, and it's hard to come in and be like, here are the rules of democracy and here's how it should be. And I don't think that we have really any interest in that. What we have interest in is giving a framework, giving a starting point for discussion, and inviting everyone into it so that we can really like challenge one another and have those deep discussions. That's sort of like the whole point of educational work, and I would argue also of democracy work.
Yeah. It was a phenomenal session. You go to these big, huge conference spaces and you kind of expect that you're going to get talked at, right? Or there's going to be some interesting things. Maybe you're going to turn to your neighbor, but like literally the whole room just reconvened around these round tables. And then maybe one of the best, most generative conversations, I had at ASH because of the people in that space. So I just want to shout out to you both for facilitating, but then all of the folks who helped kind of at the tables, and then Anna for kind of imagining alongside, which I think is a testament to ASH's kind of breaking some of those rules, right? Conference conventions and such. So, well, let's get into talking about the model. For those people who are listening, we are going to show on this screen a picture of the model, and Demetri is going to kind of walk through a little bit. And then our plan is to also link this document in the show notes or in the episode website. So folks who are listening to the podcast, we definitely encourage you to go there so you can kind of experience the visual. So Demetri, tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so one of the things that is also important in terms of the context, and I'm going to run through this because there's lots of other things we want to talk about, so I definitely encourage you all to follow up with the links and resources. But the redesign language was also really intentional. And so just like Heather and Adam have mentioned that, we are looking for spaces and places for people to wrestle with the framework and to talk about it and to dream with it and to critique it. As a working group and as a team, we did that with each other. And even the name of redesign was trying to kind of acknowledge that there is some ways that democracy needs to be sort of designed anew and afresh. And there's other ways that we think, or other things that we think are kind of hallmarks, but need to be reformed. And so even sitting in that tension is really important, and it sort of, was modeled within our sort of inner workings as a team. And as we've kind of slowly rolled it out, we've seen people activated by this. And so our hope, again, is that this activates you. We invite disagreement or skepticism or like, oh, and even at the table that I was facilitating, there were so many, sort of really interesting thoughts where I'm like, yeah, we didn't think about that. Or yeah, I would love or see how that works in. And so, as you're sort of listening to this, but also in your follow-up with this, we invite you to kind of use this as a framework to think with campus partners, to think with students, student organizations about what this looks like on your particular campus or in your unit. So as we mentioned, it's really important to always emphasize we're talking about a more aspirational version of democracy. And that's trying to sit in the tension that, as we've mentioned a few times, democracy has never worked for some people, for some groups. And so when we talk about an aspiration, we are trying to dream up and sort of have an idea of, radical hope that things can be different to the extent that we can work together, think together, and remain in tension with how we move forward. So we sort of say that up front, kind of right at the top and big and bold. The center component of the framework talks about what democracy redesigned is, and we sort of stand firmly on the principles of equity, inclusion, and justice. We know in some parts of the country those have become bad words, but we think that democracy, as sort of thought of and conceived in its best version, is one where people have what they need, which is a sort of crass version of or definition of equity, but is inclusive, which means people can participate a variety of ways, and is also just, right? Meaning that there is a sense of being able to live and experience, the sort of fullness of humanity in both the structural way and in the more social way. So we sort of, the framework stands on those components, and we think when these kind of six principles or practices are lived into, and it leads us more into this idea of equity, inclusion, and justice. So, really briefly, the different components of the framework starts with this idea of um, democracy redesigned is contested and reinvented. And so this idea, in short, is what we've been talking about this whole time, that we don't believe in sort of the static notion of democracy, that the contest of power, of people saying, hey, we want things to be different, or hey, we need to hold on to some of these things. There's actually some good in the way that we talk about liberty, or there's actually some good in the way that we, have separation of church and state, whatever it may be. This idea of conserving things, but also progressing, right, which we know sort of makes up the parties, that's the bedrock of contested and reinvented. And we think that that's a healthy component. There are things we want to conserve, there are things we want to progress past. And so a democracy redesign does that. The second pillar is this idea of educated and informed. As educators, of course, we had to make sure that that was prominently in there. And so it was really important for us to think about this idea of what does it mean to actually be educated? What does it mean to think about the developmental experiences that we know students are going to go through in the college environment in particular, and also recognizing that you can be educated, you can be a really great engineer, but not be informed at all about what's going on in public affairs or what's going on with your government. So we ground this in the media, we ground this in the way that people consume information, that we want students in a society that is both educated and informed, and the interplay of those two things being really powerful. The third practice is this idea of compassionate and empowering. We were working on this framework in the midst of COVID-19. And so when you think about what it means to be compassionate, where, what does it mean to wear a mask, to protect your neighbor, to think about first responders and people who are, sort of part of, different industries that are having to work. There's this idea of compassion that feels really important to a society that wants to be engaged in democracy when you're thinking about more than just yourself, but also one that's empowering, right? What does it mean to engage in, sort of practices that allow people to be empowered in their life experiences, to recognize different forms of expertise, to understand how different people need to, sometimes get out of the way, or to move aside so that other people can be activated. And so balancing those ideas was really important. And you'll notice that there's balance in a lot of these, which is sort of also something that we thought was important. The next one is this idea of trustworthy. So ultimately, when you're working in groups, when you're working in society, there has to be a sort of fundamental idea of trust. So, not way back, but, 30 years ago, this idea of bowling alone or social capital, how we engage in civic organizations, or, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, and what does that look like in today's day and age to develop trust in one another, in a sort of social media environment, in a, artificial intelligence environment, where trust in what is genuine is really hard to determine. And so we thought that this idea and concept of trustworthy, maybe it doesn't look like social capital, but this idea of being able to understand and believe, sort of your fellow person and what they're saying and what they're doing, and also having trust in the systems is really important. Which leads to responsive and just. This is a little bit more on the governance side of things, but we want policies and systems that are responsive and just to individuals. So, can we access the ballot box? Are people able to navigate the, criminal justice system in ways that are responsive to, sort of changing norms and expectations? What does it look like to make sure that governance is accountable, that, politicians and policymakers are accountable to people, is really important. And then lastly, this idea of accessible and participatory. To do democracy together, people have to have access, and this is access broadly defined, everything from thinking about ability and how people can experience things in ways that are responsive and thoughtful to the different ways people experience life. all the way to making sure people can access, the opportunity to vote for their individuals, or, thinking about dreamers here, or documented individuals or undocumented individuals. What does it look like to be have an accessible democracy and a participatory democracy, as alongside really rote and kind of concise ways of thinking about participation. So we wanted to dream and be expansive, because we know that there are lots of different individuals who are participating in democracy, even if it's not codified in very narrow ways like voting. And so in this category, we think really expansively about the practices that go into an accessible participatory democracy. So that was the 30-second Cliff Notes version, but hopefully that gives sort of an idea, and also piques your interest to kind of follow up and read a little bit more. We have kind of little blurbs and summaries of each of these things, but that's kind of the general sense of those components.
Wow, thank you so much. This was a great refresher for me as I listened to you all talk about it at ASH, and then reflecting on the conversation that we ended up having at our table. Adam, other things you'd like to add to the description of the model?
Demetri crushed it. So I don't want to even touch it. I think you did a great job. I'll say, just because I realize we're referencing a lot this ASH session, I'll just say that, so what we did was we shared the background on it, some of the stuff that we've talked about today, and then we put out some discussion questions too at the tables. And so I think our hope is that we'll be able to have more of a public digital gathering space for people on this. So for anyone that's listening or watching this, we'll link what we can, including the image of the model. But I think things to look for coming forward on this will be, we've already done some writing on this. We have the questions from this, and we will be packaging some of the early discussion feedback that we got too.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's going to be future opportunities for the audience for this podcast to connect, either directly or through some kind of, longer process. Do you want to say more about, where and how and that kind of thing? Like, how can they make sure that they stay in touch if it's just going to a website even?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think definitely I'll say, I think you can reach out to Demetri and I with questions or anything like that for clarification, or to just engage us. I think we're always happy to chat on email or Twitter or whatever. But in terms of gathering spaces for this, like I said, it's my guess is it'll probably come out in various ways. It will probably be redundant across multiple websites. I know that Nancy at AAC&U will have it up on the IDHE website at some point, as these things come out. And I should note, I think this episode will be up, and most people will listen to this after the moment has passed. But at this week's AAC&U conference, there are going to be sessions on this too. So we're trying to really get this out there for people to engage critically with, and to think about, and to offer feedback to. I think it's still a little bit to be determined how we're going to gather some of the feedback, but I think our goal is to have some sort of digital spot at the very least, to where people can kind of add comments or read through this, and maybe some Google Docs and things like that that'll be interactive for folks.
Cool. Yeah, very cool. I'd love to hear a little bit. Our audience is, folks who work in higher education, in student affairs roles. There's practitioners, graduate students, faculty. So when I think about the application, I think about engaging college students in some of these bigger conversations. How college students come to identify themselves. And Demetri, you said earlier about political identity development, that's super fascinating. And before we started recording, we were talking about coming to college is often a time to define yourself outside of how your parents have, or your guardians or others have kind of framed your identity. So that also relates, of course, to politics. I'd love to just spend a few minutes kind of in this space of How do we take this and make it applicable on our campuses and then keep the conversation going with students? Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, so I'll start off. So I think about it on like 50 levels, but I'll
Yeah.
try to be concise. So one of them, when we look at the research about sort of students' political identity development, one of the things that was so fascinating to me and why I chose to do my dissertation work on it is because a lot of the literature was kind of done in the post-World War II, where people were like, we got to fight off communism and, make great, American citizens. And, what was most fascinating to me when we think about that time period with, the GI Bill and, sort of many other things where this idea of the middle class was created is that people became very comfortable with this idea that the responsibility for civic education, it was a K through 12 endeavor. And between your K through 12, your church, and your home life, people were going to get enough socialization to be good citizens. And, you can see sort of the flaws in that thinking and sort of who is included in that model of K through 12, sort of your church and your home life. And so as so my mom is from Jamaica, grew up in a single parent household, and we were not having conversations around the dinner table about voting. She came, she had a green card and became a naturalized citizen, but that was well into my or early in my adult life. And so this idea of what is the role of higher education for me is both personal but also really interesting, because we know, and not sort of saying anything bad about our K through 12 colleagues, but we know that the education is going to be really different for different students coming through the K through 12 pipeline when they get to us on college campuses. We know, increasingly, right, most students identify as nuns religiously. So there are, sort of a whole swath of people who are having their civic engagement look very different. That's not just codified in a church or synagogue. And then again, we know that people's home life, whether this parent or guardian, is much more complex and differentiated than we thought. So if the pillars of how we thought about socialization are much different now in 2024 than when a lot of the writing was done in the 60s through 80s, to me, that is like what our call as higher ed professionals, student affairs educators in particular, is that work, it continues for us, right? So for me, again, my own story includes getting to the University of Florida and having opportunities to participate in fraternities and orientation and different things where we were having to deal with what was going on politically or nationally, talk with students, and I was learning from mentors that say like, hey, here's how we talk about these things, or here's how these things intersect with your own lived experiences. And that was really powerful for me. And so I think there's opportunities, all that to say, where we can play a role, right? Like higher ed can't do all of the socialization around politics, but I think we have a really unique and important role in the opportunities that we have to have those conversations, to think about, wow, what happened on Tuesday at the Iowa, or Monday at the Iowa caucuses? What did you see? What did you hear? What was interesting? How does that relate to where you grew up? How was it different? And those probing questions get students to think, right? And help them think about their own values, their own lived experiences. And so I think really practically being willing to have those conversations, not in a way, and I know everybody's always like, well, we're gonna indoctrinate students. And I'm like, students are way more resilient than we give them credit for. Like, when have you ever been able to convince a 20-year-old to do something that they don't want to do, right? Like it's they they're going to sort of they're open to opportunities for conversation. And I think that's something that we can cultivate as higher ed educators. How do we have conversations that are thoughtful? And that's one of the things we're excited about this framework, is it gives us sort of a way into conversation about what we hope this society can look like, that then have opportunities for follow-up. So it's a really flowery answer, but I think really tangibly it's having opportunities to have conversations about what people want to experience as they move, to and through their different phases of life, and thinking about that role that we can play as advisors or, sort of student or, mentors in the different spaces that we take up.
Yeah. Adam, go ahead.
So in addition to everything Demetri said, which I agree with, um, so when I was doing my dissertation, which is like 10 years ago now, I defended in 2015. What I was studying was how students were using social media and how it was impacting their civic learning and participation, and everything ranging from their activism to just kind of surface level learning around different issues. And I remember at that time there was a cohort of us, I think many of whom have been guests on this very show, across the country, who were studying issues on digital platforms and social media, and we all became friends. Um, and one of the things I feel like was a common refrain from all of us to professionals was to think beyond just like the physical campus around what was happening, and to not just disregard it and be like, oh, that's online, like, and I don't mean that in the sense of like policing what was happening in other spaces, but to really think about student development and think about the full student experience in a way that has changed, at that point even. And I think that there are some of that's continued and some of it is more like parallel in this discussion. Um, I think that the ways in which students are gathering information has changed completely since that time. Some of the challenges that they're facing in terms of their democratic participation and their civic engagement has changed. And so I think that like anyone who considers themselves an educator in the K-16 plus space, like I think needs to think about like what does that mean? Like what are we up against in terms of dis and misinformation? What are we up against in terms of how quickly like activist movements can happen, and how does that fly in the face of like these traditional structures of student engagement, which for a long time I think have been outmoded in comparison to how things happen. And that gives students a reason to turn away from their college or university when they're like, oh, I'm not going to wait 6 months for funding or 6 months for a space or like recognition in the student organization process. So I think that like it's easy to manage something away sometimes. As someone who worked in student affairs for 6 years, like I've seen it. Like you can put up these structural barriers to stop students by just being like, oh, there's like these 10 different forms and they each take a week to get processed. Or you can just wait for a student to graduate. I've seen people do things like that.
Yeah.
And that's not that to me, that's not being an educator. Like that's failing on the duties of the role. So but in terms of like some of the positive things that people can do, especially in student affairs, I think that putting students in spaces of cognitive dissonance and in spaces where they're challenged and in spaces where they challenge themselves to think with depth around different issues and to engage with others from sometimes like very different backgrounds from their own, sometimes like a little bit different. I think that that's all part of the learning experience. And I think that a lot of that, with student safety in mind, of course, within reason, I'm talking here, but to allow students to have moments of critical thinking and to intentionally set up those environments is really an important part of this work. And I think, like I said, I don't think Demetri and I view this as like a prescriptive thing, but I think that, this framework and others that are out there are ways to start thinking about like, how does my work align with this? I always say to folks that are in our space, look at your college's statements around civic, their mission statement, where they'll say, we prepare students for civic life, or, for active engagement in democracy. But there is a question of like, are you actually doing your work in a way that aligns with that? And are you thinking about that when you're planning out events, learning opportunities, engagement? And I think that, this is what we're trying to provide here is yet another way for people to think about aligning mission, vision, and values with like daily practice.
Yeah.
And strategic planning.
Yeah, I know campuses are often kind of rethinking that, and I think you raised a couple of really interesting, one is the bricks and mortar of the campus isn't always the boundary. It can be in lots of other spaces. And when I think about like where students learn, that is a whole nother topic. And I think the conversations among and between, we also lost some of that ability during COVID to come together and actually be in spaces where we had to experience, kind of that dissonance, because we could just, you know, turn off our camera, go on mute. It's like that ability to be in that kind of space of discomfort. And I think we're seeing the repercussions of that now to a certain extent on our campuses, where at least on my campus, I'm seeing a lot of like struggles with being in those kind of intergroup dialogue spaces. Just to preview some future episodes that we're queuing up, because I think it's a part of a larger conversation about what
Yeah.
does that conversation look like.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that there will be, and I can't wait to check out the future episodes, because one of the things that I was going to bring up that I'm thinking a lot about now is how, and to answer the sort of original question as well, about what folks can be doing or how to sort of enact this is, I think for many of us that were working on college campuses in 2016, after the sort of surprise election, and many campuses were caught flat-footed in terms of providing sort of student resources and support. And then, we go to 2020 and we're sort of peak pandemic time. So there was campus stuff, but it was more muted. And now, in 2024, so one of the things in terms of, I feel like we've gotten a little rusty as campuses where like the voter engagement stuff is really strong, and that's important. But, Adam and I both are on an approach like that is a component of a component, right? Like, yes, we want active voter engagement, get out the vote. That's so important, but there are all of these other components to how we can engage students in this, and part of it is being proactive and thinking through, regardless of how the election turns out, there's going to be all of these little things that happen to and through and are already happening, to and through, that campuses need to be prepared for, and so what are those conversations at department meetings around, hey, if this were to happen, like, if Trump gets indicted and can't actually be on the ballot, and there are going to be segments of our students who feel like that is the biggest injustice ever, what are we going to do? What supports are we going to provide? Vice versa, right? If certain candidate wins or certain things happen, and what I'm anxious about is the pandemic, kind of in terms of that institutional response, hasn't, we haven't had to activate that in terms of intergroup dialogue, in terms of how to model, some of this critical thinking well in person, right? Like where there's proximity. And so I'm hoping and encouraging people to be proactive now, thinking about those things, because, November 2024 will be here before we know it, but there are going to be a ton of things that happen before it. And, the time is now to sort of be thinking about that beyond voter engagement, beyond what are we doing for get out the vote, what are the other supports and systems, and do we have a plan with all the various scenarios that are going on, in contextualized for your state, right? Contextualized for, because one of the things we hear all the time, I'm in red state so-and-so, and we can't say these things. And it's like, yeah, that's fair, but ultimately we want to support students, we want to create educational environments. So how do we talk about it and be, creative in our conversations? And that takes even more planning if you are in a context where you maybe can't as readily, think about things and do things. And so that's where the sort of, proactive and being on offense is really important to me. And we're starting to see some of it, but for how things might play out, I'm curious and encouraging others to think about that more and more.
This has been such a great conversation. I'm glad that we kind of, broke away from the script and just kind of chatted at the end, because there's so many other, there has to be like 2.0 or 3.0 conversation here, particularly as we get closer and then beyond the election, which I know is just a component of all of this, but is definitely sparking my attention. So this episode, or this podcast rather, is called Student Affairs Now. I'd love to hear a couple of final thoughts about what you're pondering, considering, thinking about, troubling. And then if you would like folks to be able to connect with you, any way that they can do that, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter, or if people are still using Twitter, this has been a conversation we've been having. It's like, do we even still say that? Or other ways that folks can connect with you. So Demetri, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so one of the other things on top of just kind of being prepared for all of the things and trying not to be flat-footed, so having those conversations, I'm also really worried about student burnout around politics in particular, because of how, sort of activated, whether it's, sort of Israel, Hamas, or, there's still the lingering impacts of Me Too and, the summer of 2020 and George Floyd, that we haven't, sort of engaged in restorative ways to sort of think through those traumas. And now we're adding on top of it. And, for many of us that are working with student leaders who are experiencing and being responsive to all these things. So what is sort of political burnout is basically the question I've been thinking look like. Are people exhausted by the conversation, exhausted by the, sort of 24/7, sort of CNN, Fox News of it all, and how do we still do all of the aspirational things we've talked about to this point when people are tired and burnt out and cynical. And so that's why we invite people to think with us. I don't have the answer to that, but I would love for us, as a community of higher ed educators and student affairs professionals in particular, to think through, like, how do we support students through burnout in ways that manifest differently, because it's not just like racial battle fatigue, or it's not just the sort of like activist labor that Chris Linder and others have talked about, but there's this particular component of politics that I'm really interested in. And then, yeah, where you can find me, I'm on LinkedIn, still have a Twitter, but not that active, at D Morgan PhD. And so, yeah, I would love to connect. Obviously, I get really excited about these topics and love hearing from others and learning from others. And so, please, definitely reach out and connect.
Great. Thanks, Demetri. Adam.
So one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is, and actually, like, this has been kind of an ongoing curiosity of mine, is like sort of youth political identity development, which was brought up earlier, but I think like some of the researchers in the space, I feel like often revert back to kind of traditional forms of, like, is a student a Democrat, or are they a Republican, or are they magically an independent, or and I think that what I've seen, and I draw a lot of my, like, the most interesting things that I see are in, like, the space of intersecting of, like, arts, library sciences, information technology, and people that, like, aren't really, like, traditional researchers that, like, kind of dig into these issues, that are just kind of like, they're probably online too much, but they, like, have these observations of, like, what they're seeing in the spaces. And one of them is really, really hyper specific, sometimes contradictory political identities in young people. So they don't see themselves, I mean, they're like miles from being part of a political party, and there are issues that they care about, but the ground, like, shifts very quickly underneath them, and they see themselves as kind of like a patchwork identity of different viewpoints. And it's like, to me, that seems very unpredictable. And, like, I say that without any actually, like, positive or negative judgment on it. It's actually just, I'm just curious about it, of, like, how those identities form, and then what implications that has long term for, like, the political identity of the country, and then globally, because I think that's actually very much a product of the internet and how social media works, is that you have kind of these, like, different clusters of, like, how someone views themselves and how they understand and engage with, like, the political arena and democracy. So that's something I'm always following, that, like, general area of interest. If people want to connect with me, yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best. Like, feel free to add me, just Adam Gismondi. There's one other one out there. He works for World Wrestling Entertainment, and it's not me. But we do accidentally get emails for each other and forward back and forth, so we have a funny dialogue.
That's hilarious that you know that.
Same middle name too, which is the really strange thing. But yeah, LinkedIn, and Twitter is just Adam Gismondi, or email me. I think it's up on our website. And yeah, we'll be sharing links for other ways to connect with the work. And yeah, thanks for listening to this point for anyone that's still on.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both. Just really appreciate the conversation and the generative work that you all are doing in this space. And I'm really excited to have our listeners engage. I also want to take a moment to express our gratitude for our producer, Nat Ambrosi, does all this amazing work behind the scenes to make us look and sound great. You are amazing, Nat. And also thanks to today's episode sponsors. So LeaderShape partners with colleges and universities to create transformational leadership experiences for students and professionals with a focus on creating a more just, caring, and thriving world. LeaderShape offers engaging learning experiences on courageous dialogue, integrity, equity, resilience, and community building. And you can find out more by visiting leadershape.org or connect with them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn. And Routledge Taylor Francis is the world's leading academic publisher in education, publishing a wide range of books, journals, and other resources for practitioners, faculty, and administrators and researchers. Recently, Routledge Taylor Francis welcomed Stylus Publishing to their publishing program, and they are thrilled to enrich their offerings in higher education, teaching, student affairs, professional development, assessment, and more. And so we're really grateful for their support of the podcast, Student Affairs Now, and you can visit and view their complete catalog of education titles at routledge.com/education. So to all of our listeners, if you're tuning in today, haven't yet subscribed to our weekly newsletter, please take a moment to enter your email on our website. And while you're there, you can download our recent archives, recently published episodes, and look forward to seeing you all in the future. Once again, I'm Heather Shea. Thanks for everybody who's watching, listening. Let's make it a great week.